person who likes to play on who likes to manipulate emotions so that you guys will move forward a little bit. I'm actually a freelance editor, which has nothing to do with manipulating emotions whatsoever. I specialize in science fiction and fantasy, and it is my professional job to bust the myths that people put in their stories.
My name is Helge Mouldin. I've been involved with...
People misinterpreted my signal.
Have a signal?
No.
Oh, okay. I've been involved with urban legends since about 1995. There's a group of people we've been discussing urban legends in the vein of the kind of stuff that Harold Brundtland was writing about, you know, the choking Doberman and the vanishing hitchhiker, those kinds of stories. And in the course of talking about urban legends, we also talk about all of these other things that people like to believe because we all wish they were true. So I'm very familiar with a lot of them.
Okay. My name is Swedin. I'm a professor of history at Weber State. My specialization is history of science and technology. As a historian, I am constantly disabusing people of a variety of myths about the present day and about history. And as someone with an extensive science background, there's a variety of things that I'm constantly disabusing people of. And so I think this is a really fascinating panel. I'm also a science fiction writer. I have 11 published books, 5 of which are novels. My chief claim to fame as a writer is I wrote a book called When Angels Wept, A What If History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which won the Sidewise Award for Best Alternate History of the Year. It was a fascinating book to write because I blew up the world.
Hi, my name is Alicia McIntire. I'm a data analyst for the Utah College of Applied Technology. For that, I was an auditor for the state of South Carolina. And a lot of what I did there and what I do now is both analyzing systems and kind of challenging some of the assumptions people have currently about education and before about things like pensions and other states.
Cool. My name is Bacera. I'm a military fantasy writer. And I'm a math teacher and math tutor by profession, so my job is to point out mathematical fallacies to people all the time. That's what I do. And
I'm Eric James Stone. I've had a bunch of short fiction published in various markets, including analog and the scientific journal Nature. It was science fiction, but it was still in the scientific journal Nature. I won a Nebula Award a few years ago for one of my novelettes. My first novel came out from Bain last year. The mass market paperback comes out in May. It's called Unforgettable, so don't forget to buy it.
Okay, so I kind of want to gauge the room a little bit so we can get our discussion. How many of you are science fiction writers? Okay, cool.
How many of you are aspiring science fiction writers?
still the same amount.
Okay, cool. So what do you guys, what are the rest of you? Yeah, fantasy writers?
Fantasy writers don't need facts. What are you talking about?
Okay, cool.
Horses.
Are you looking for more like hard science facts that you want to dispute, or are you looking for like research tips?
General entertainment. It's late, we're tired.
Wait, put us on the spot.
Definitely agree.
All right. Okay. So with that, let's go through and each person pick one thing that they totally loathe that's like gotten perpetuated in fiction. Some fact or something like the horses that run forever. And we'll start the discussion there. So Mr. Johnson.
Okay, one of the things that I hear people saying a lot relates to black holes. The idea that black holes just suck everything in, you know. And well, yeah, if you get close enough, they do. But here's the thing. If our sun turned into a black hole just like that, it wouldn't suck the Earth in. The Earth would just continue to orbit around it. It would get very cold and dark. But basically, the mass of a black hole is the mass of whatever collapsed to form the black hole originally, plus anything that has fallen in since. So you can have supermassive black holes in the center of galaxies where tons of stars have fallen in, but it's not like it's reaching out and grabbing more stuff. It's just stuff that happens to get close enough that it starts spiraling in and eventually falls in. So you can get close to a black hole, and as long as you've got a sufficiently strong star drive or whatever, you can pull away from its gravity, just like you can pull away from Earth's gravity.
Unless you get too close.
Unless you get too close. Yeah. You know, if you cross the event horizon, it's really tough to get back.
Sure. So I write military fantasy, so I spend a lot of time looking up French terms of cavalry, infantry, and artillery, and looking at numbers of how effective they are at killing each other. And despite what a lot of fantasy like to tell you, knights on horses, fighting other knights on horses, is not a very effective way to have combat. It just doesn't work. In fact, like, most of the time, killing is done when the forces are asymmetrical. So, infantry getting the jump on cavalry is a really great way to kill people. Also, cavalry somehow breaking through infantry is a great way to kill people. But cavalry on cavalry is very inefficient. So, that's what she likes to write, knights on knights combat. It's pretty unrealistic.
So, how many people have heard we only use 10% of our brain? That is so not true on every single level that you can think about. And let's just bury that under a gravestone called Lucy.
It's true.
So how that actually came about is that like 10% of your neurons are firing at any given time. The way that neurons work is they can only go one direction at a time. So like if you're only using quote unquote 50% of your brain at a time, that's like a grand mal seizure and you're dead. Like your brain is completely fried and you can't use more than 50% or whatever of your neurons firing at once. So like 10% is lovely and normal and healthy. You're still using your entire brain. It's just having all of your neurons firing at once is bad. So like, yeah, no, there's no secret 90% portion of your brain that's gonna.
It has psychic abilities. And if I may add one more. The trope that you see, not usually in written science fiction, but in bad science fiction movies about cloning. For some reason people acquire the memories of their source of the DNA. And you're going like, your memories are not stored in your DNA. There's no way for this to happen. This is a stupid idea that has...
You know, Assassin's Creed is not real.
Assassin's Creed fails on almost every scientifically plausible reason, including jumping off buildings.
You'll go right through that and through the cardinal to the concrete below. You know, when it comes to jumping off buildings, you're getting to actually one of the biggest science fails that you see in fiction, in all kinds of fiction, all your action movies. The best example I can think of at the moment is if you've seen John Carter of Mars, the movie that just recently came out, and you have this tiny guy throw around this humongous creature, this humongous Mars monster. And we're supposed to believe, well, he can do that because he's got Earth muscles.
Well, that's what
But
it
the
looks
monster
like.
is still like 1,000 pounds of monster. You're not going to hang on to the end of 1,000 pounds of monster and swing it around like a hammer. This kind of stuff, these kinds of, they look so cool. We love to watch that because it gets the heart pounding, it gets the blood moving, and you want the hero to win, and it really makes the hero's winning really special. But it's horrible science, and it drives me nuts when I see it. It's like, do you... Superheroes. In X-Men, what was it called again?
There's a lot of those. You're going to
Yeah,
have to
Now, talk about the one where the aliens came through the wormhole. Avengers, right. You're still talking about these guys are not more than maybe 200 pounds, the really heavily muscled Thor, and they're punching out school buses? I don't think so! But it just doesn't work!
I'm going to actually go a little bit of a different direction and hope that I do this right. I'm going to talk about the real world thing, and I'm going to do it because the way that this happens matters, and maybe we'll talk about this more on the panel, but my pet peeve is the false idea that vaccines cause autism. This is wrong, and I really hope that all of you know this. Vaccines do not cause autism. And
Vaccines cause life.
No, it's actually a really good thing to bring up, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was how bad science gets perpetuated such that, you know, like the 10% thing, it just becomes so ubiquitous that everyone believes it, even though it's...
Well, but this is a myth that kills people.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to talk about, even in this environment. And here's how that science happens, is that the guy in England who originally did this, his goal was to get a patent on his new measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. And he wanted to make money with that. So the best way to make money on a new vaccine is to prove that the old one is bad somehow. So he made this study, he cherry-picked his subjects, he falsified the data in lots of bad ways that were discovered afterwards, and he made the study that made it seem like this measles, mumps, rubella vaccine might cause autism. And I don't think he was even expecting it to cause the furor that it caused. I don't think he was thinking it would go anywhere near there. He's now become a martyr for that cause. But he originally did this with the intent to make money. And then people who didn't like vaccines for various reasons, mostly because they were scared for some reason of what was in it. I can't pronounce these long chemical names. Whatever it was, they were scared of putting chemicals into their kids. They were scared of things. Some people had noticed that right after vaccination, coincidentally, is when their kids started manifesting signs of autism. That would have happened anyway without the vaccine. And so there's confirmation bias going on, and there was all this stuff where people wanted to believe that vaccines were evil for some reason. And whatever reason. And they all jumped in on this study as finally the proof we've been looking for. And it has been repeated and repeated. And like most conspiracy theories that are the fact that the guy who originally did the study has now been kicked out of medicine and proven wrong and his study retracted just goes to show that there's a big conspiracy and that they're all against us and that we really know the truth. And that is how humans work. It's emotional. It's not logical. It's not about thinking or reasoning. It's about this confirms my thoughts and it makes me feel good because I was right all along.
Not only that, but if something terrible happens to your kids, you'd like to be able to blame that on someone.
That's correct. People want an explanation for autism. Science is unable to provide an explanation. So they went and found an explanation, and when you tell them they're wrong, you don't get the substance. We can't tell them what would be right because we don't know. People, when they have the trauma of having a child who has autism, they want to know why, and it's easy to go blame this, and people engage in conspiratorial thinking. In conspiratorial thinking, the basis conspiratorial thinking is the belief that everything that happens in the world has a cause, an intentional cause. Someone intended for that to happen. And you just need to figure out who it is that intended that to happen. And when you're told that you're wrong, that person who tells you that just becomes part of the conspiracy. And you feel this sense of, I know something that other people don't know. I am more powerful mentally because I know this. And conspiratorial thinking, people who are conspiratorial thinkers almost always are conspiratorial thinkers on a variety of things. And these make them feel more comfortable, and it helps them explain the world. But the key at the core is the idea that the world is not random, that the world is always intentional. And if something happened, someone must have intended for that to happen. Now, as a historian, there is a law in history. It's called the law of unintended consequences. And it trips up pretty much every conspiratorial theory. And people need to remember it and recognize that a lot of what happens in the world actually is truly random, or an outcome that was not intentional, but a side effect of what something else people were trying to do.
May I jump on like that?
Yeah.
I think bad science is perpetuated by bad math. Like, even if you look at the records of said person, right? You're basically, if you decide that you don't want to vaccinate your kids because you're scared of autism, it's like you burning down your house because you're scared it might get struck by a meteorite. I mean, like, that's true. Is anybody reading the numbers? Like, they're there. The studies are there. Even if they're doctored, they're still there. It's like, I'm afraid my child, like, it's just got to be not people not understanding the numbers and what they mean in real life.
In America, we live in a world in which we expect all our children to grow to adulthood. That is an abnormal historical experience. If you go back further in a century, most people, if they were realistic, was going to look in at 10 to 50% of their kids were not going to reach adulthood. That was just the reality of it. People who believe that they don't have to do vaccines are not only naive, not only actionably evil, because by not vaccinating their children, they create risk for everyone else. They live in a world that is so comfortable, they have forgotten what the true consequences are of a world in which vaccines and modern medicine doesn't exist. Okay, now we can.
Okay, so there are actually a lot of these kinds of things in modern medicine. So how many of you have ever taken airborne or emergency? It's totally.
What does it say on the package of the airborne? What does it say on the package? Developed by an elementary school teacher or mom or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, and
This is the kind of recommendation I want to see on my medicine.
So those claim to work by having lots of vitamin C in them, right? Vitamin C doesn't do anything for colds. Spoilers. They were created, or that idea was come up with in like the 70s.
Even the guy that got a Nobel Prize for his work on vitamin C, who initially...
No, he did not.
He did not?
He got it for
He got 2 Nobel Prizes.
Right.
Linus Pauling in the 30s basically defined how chemical bonds work. One of the most important chemists ever. In the 1960s, he got the Nobel Prize because he was one of the leaders for the open air test ban for nuclear weapons testing.
Cool.
It was only later that he lost his marbles and decided that vitamin C cured everything.
But he retracted that later, though, didn't he?
Props with his death. I'm not aware that he ever, before his death,
I
retracted.
think he was a crazy until he died.
Yeah.
He was a
He was
crazy
not
old
a
man.
medical doctor. He got a
He was a
Nobel
chemist.
Prize for some other things, and then he was like the Neil deGrasse Tyson, like he was super popular, and people were like, well, he says that vitamin C cures colds and a slew of other things. Like, and so that's another way bad science gets perpetuated.
Well, and it's interesting here, there's a difference between these two things we're talking about, vaccines and airborne. If you take airborne, you're not hurting yourself. You're not hurting anyone else. You've wasted a couple of bucks.
It's a little bit of sugar with flavoring.
Yeah, but no one is adversely affected by
Well, your
this.
peeing's gonna be exciting if you
Yeah. And some of the other stuff we're talking, like vaccines, that matters. People getting measles can go blind. People getting pertussis can die. My own wife has lung damage from a whooping cough episode that she had on her mission, and she cannot run. She cannot do cardiovascular activity because she has damage to her lungs because her vaccine expired and she didn't get the booster shot before she left. And when I think of people who are willing to risk their baby going through that and possibly dying, there's actual harm happening. And when we're talking about writing things, I want you to keep in mind the different effects of some of these myths. If people believe some of these myths, it's going to be rather benign. And other myths, it's going to make a really big difference. And in your writing, you can reflect which is which. And you can do that accurately. And that's going to be a service to everyone who reads your book.
Can I ask a question? By raising your hands, how many people are personally alive right now because of modern experimental medicine? Modern medicine.
Modern medicine, I am.
All these people would be dead if modern medicine wasn't there. Me personally, it was a brain aneurysm.
I have asthma.
And there's
I was born in a third world country.
But he made it to America!
Thank you, smallpox booster.
By the way, I might want to point out that if you look at surveys of who are anti-vaxxers in America, the most strong population that believes in vaccines are people who are immigrants from third world countries because they have come from places where these diseases still exist and they know what it really means. You know who it is against vaccines most commonly? Rich, affluent, white Americans. Rich, affluent is kind of redundant.
Okay, so moving on from vaccines.
I'm not sorry I brought it up.
It's a good thing to bring up, especially since there tends to be a lot of harmful myths particularly in science and medicine. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Either other myths in those areas or ways that we do ourselves disservice by perpetuating some of these things.
No, I'm just going to go off on a tangent. This one is I didn't know this until just a few months ago that I was had one of these myths and thought it was absolutely true. You know how wolf packs are organized? There's the alpha male, there's the fight for dominance and all that. Yeah, that's based on a study of wolves in captivity. And the myth has been perpetuated for a long, long time. In the wild, wolves basically have family packs, the parents and the kids, and there's no fight for dominance. The kids obey the parents, basically, kind of thing. And then the kids go off to form families of their own. It's only in captivity that you have the alpha male, kind of thing going on. And so, if you're going to write werewolf fiction, maybe you ought to...
Family-friendly werewolves!
You need to imprison your werewolves with non-related other males so that they can fight for dominance.
Your six-pack abs are a prison, though. Right?
What's interesting about that is that as recently as the initial studies of wolves that had been introduced to Yellowstone, which wasn't that long ago, scientists, biologists were still interpreting the behavior of these wolves in Yellowstone in terms of the myth that Eric is talking about. So the stories that we tell each other about the things that we think we know, when they are not so, even though we think they are so, they influence a lot more than just people who talk about stuff by the water cooler during lunch.
Well, I like that. I like this myth that Eric brought up, is because there was recently a National Geographic picture that shows a line of wolves, and then there's an older one that's obviously slower in the back of the pack. And then somebody grabbed this picture that's like, hey, this shows, they're abandoning the older, weaker wolf. And then the photographer actually came up and was like, no, wait, I'm the guy who tracked this pack. they would slow down and wait for this older wolf because he was part of the family. Like, you can't take my picture and perpetuate lies. This is unfair.
I have another one. This is biological. Lemmings. We all know that lemmings go crazy and all run off the cliff. Well, so that image actually comes from the 1950s from a Disney nature documentary. And what they're not showing you in the documentary is the bulldozer that's driving the lemmings off the cliff, because the photographers are going like, we can't wait for the lemmings to all jump off. We need to make it happen.
They actually have photographers going and shoving the lemmings off little rocks so that they could film them
So they
plummeting
could
down.
get footage. So,
The only animals that behave like lemmings are humans when they find a bad idea.
That's what Shades of Grey was about.
Do we have a question around here? Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Swedin, you mentioned the law of unintended consequences. Does that go beyond the idea that actions have unintended consequences? Is there more to that law than just that basic concept, or is that pretty much it?
the idea behind the law of unintended consequences is that if you're a historian and you look at what motivates people to do something, and when they're trying to guide a future event, that hardly ever does it work out the way they want, because they're human beings, there are other independent actors involved, and it's very difficult to figure out exactly what's going to happen.
And people always try to guess at each other's motivations. And so when one person does something, everybody else is going to say, what is he really trying to do? And they react to that.
So I'll give you a historical myth that still crops up occasionally. How many people have heard that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, knew the Japanese were going to attack at Pearl Harbor and allowed it to happen because he wanted to join World War II? This was a pervasive myth that's been passed along for years, mostly because people really hated FDR. And it has zero basis in historical fact, and it doesn't even make sense in a historical context. Yes, it is true, FDR wanted to join World War II. He wanted to join the war against Germany. He did not want to join the war against Japan. Going to war with Japan would not in any way automatically lead to a war to Germany. The reason we went to war to Germany is because 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler decided to declare war on the United States. And we're going like, thank God. There's no way that was predictable. There was no way that that would be promoted. It is true that the American military had intercepted messages. They expected the Japanese to attack. And they were pretty certain the attack would happen in the Philippines, where in fact where it happened. They were stunned to find out when it happened at Pearl Harbor. No one had thought about that. They'd lost complete track of the Japanese aircraft carriers because the Japanese aircraft carriers were all on radio silence.
And the Admiral is smarter than our Admiral, let's be honest, right?
Well, since we fired our Admiral, I guess that must be true. So many conspiracy theories actually collapse when you just start thinking about when do people know stuff, what could people have known, what could people have thought. And
then when you start looking at whistleblowers, all you have to do to get famous is if you really know who killed Kennedy and you have conclusive proof of a conspiracy, all you gotta do to become rich and famous is come forward with that proof. That's all.
Nobody's ever done it.
And no one's ever done it. And for all these conspiracies, we didn't land on the moon, we didn't do this crazy thing happened. No one has ever decided to become rich by exposing the conspiracy. That does not make sense when you're talking about human beings.
So,
if no one comes forward, there ain't no thing.
let's talk about Kennedy for a moment. So I'm a historian, I've run across that conspiracy theory, and everyone says, you know, this plaza, and you think of this plaza, it's really big, and you think it, and you know, they're like, there's no way a person could have made that shot, and they couldn't have operated a bolt action rifle that fast. And so I actually went there once. I went to the place, and you can go to it. They even have a little person standing up in the 6th story of the
It's a museum.
depository, and they even have a mark on the road where Kennedy was shot. And you're looking at it, and I'm looking at this plaza, and I'm going like, I could have made this shot. It is.
Well, it must have been you.
It is. There is no plausible reason to have a conspiracy other than when great men or great people are killed, we want it to be
Special.
special. We want there to be a reason. And
I've been there too, and if you can make that shot, you and I need to go to the shooting range.
you don't think I can make that shot? It's
Moving
like
a
200
moving
feet.
vehicle.
What's that? Against a vehicle that's moving like 5 miles an hour.
With iron sights.
I'm sorry, he was a sharpshooter in the Army. He could have made that shot.
Okay. We were talking about the law of unintended consequences, right? That was your question?
Yes, it
So I
was. wanted
actually
to
heard
know
that
about
the other way around as an engineer, like when I was studying, like mathematicians have studied engineering, because apparently they make money with mathematics. Anyway, in engineering, the law of unintended consequences is actually a positive thing. You say that anytime you make a solution for an engineering problem, understand that you've probably had at least 3 unintended consequences of it. And the example that people like to tout is duct tape. Duct tape was created as a solution for trying to deal with HVAC systems. And the irony of it is that duct tape is horrible as an HVAC solution. Actually, they have better tape now. Tape has been developed since then that is better for sealing HVAC conduits. But unintended consequences, duct tape is great for everything else. So, it's also a good thing, by the way. When you create a solution, you are unintentionally creating at least, what in engineering they say at least 3, but I'm sure, like Eric was saying, it's infinite, right? You have 3 unintended consequences that you don't realize yet. And thank goodness, because otherwise, science would be useless to us because we're not in space with ball bearings, but that technology comes back and helps us in unintended consequences.
So as a writing tip, then use that. And for anything your characters do or any invention you want to introduce in your world, think of 3 unintended consequences. And you can either make it 2 good and 1 bad, or 2 bad and 1 good, depending on what you want to do with the story. But that will help flesh out your, well, make there at least be 1 good thing, even if it's really small and kind of insignificant.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, so in Brazil, a lot of people honestly believe, or at least did a decade ago, that if you eat watermelon and drink milk together, you will die. So I'm wondering if you've noticed how culture and economics and different things impact these belief systems, especially so how you can apply that then to your writing, depending on the culture you have in your book.
Short answer, yes, but I guess we're going to elaborate, right?
I served my mission in Italy, and they believe that if you shampooed more than once a week, it would make your hair fall out.
That's why everyone has a full head of hair in Italy.
Is there any way to create stuff like that where, to the reader, it doesn't sound totally ludicrous?
I would say one thing, like let's suppose that we're in a fantasy world and we've got not watermelon and milk, but 2 new foods. And we show a scene where somebody eats those 2 foods and then struggles and suddenly dies and falls over dead. Now, realistically, that was a heart attack that happened to coincide. However, you can then have, like, your main character was then, this little kid, and that was their first memory, and they have this impression, and you'll believe that character believes it. Absolutely. Or if you want to go down later, 100 years later, and there's this myth that is prevalent in the society, and some people scoff, but some people believe it. If you saw that first scene, you'll believe that that's a real myth in that society. So you can set these things up if they're going to be important to your plot somehow. And they don't have to be that far back in the past, but there are ways to make that happen that make it plausible. Now, keep in mind, your readers will probably have a little less respect for those characters that believe old wives' tales, so you'll have to do extra work to get them to respect those characters on other grounds.
The thing is you don't need an actual reason to believe crazy things.
In fiction, we demand these.
When the tomato was first introduced to Europe, people thought it was poisonous.
Have you tasted a tomato?
They had absolutely no reason to think so.
Right.
Tomatoes very rarely cause allergic reactions, contrary to things, wonderful stuff like peanuts that I can't have anymore. And yet people wouldn't have like, tomato, I'm dying. dying. They wouldn't have been doing that. They would have just said, yum, this tastes interesting. It's not like an apple. It's not like a pear. And that's the only kind of fruit that really was well known in Europe at the time. So here we have a juicy, colorful fruit, and people, for some reason, got it into their heads that it was poisonous. They had no reason for it. But the story spread like wildfire through the population, and everybody suddenly knew it's actually poisonous. And nobody asked themselves, if it's poisonous, why are they selling it to me?
And all you gotta do in a story to make that work is just have some character that your main character trusts and respects say, that's bad, or tell an old wives' tale, and boom, character believes it.
That's an excellent point, because we tell each other stories as a kind of social currency. This is one of the things that we talked about when we talked about urban legends. The stories we tell each other is something you can pay another person that has apparent value, but you're not losing anything when you pay this out. It is an exchange of value, a trade. Often people who are socially dominant tend to tell more of these stories. So when you are at a party, the boss's wife may be the one that tells you all the interesting stories that you know are probably not true, but you don't actually dare say it so because that's the boss's wife. You want to get your husband in bed with the boss's wife.
Yeah, a question in the back and then down here.
Well, I mean, for the tomato, the vine is actually like in relation to the poison, which keeps animals away. So that makes me think maybe that's what it was told to them, but then it perpetuated from there.
If they saw that animals wouldn't eat it, you would think it's poisonous, you wouldn't try it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the vine, not the tomato.
Right.
Itself. Yeah.
Well, does that bring up an interesting point that the misinterpretation of facts, creating myths, is actually a really good world-building thing. And if you can create a lot of cool myths that have become misinterpreted facts and you build it into your storyline, then yes, you have a very interesting storyline.
Yeah, down here.
Well, then you get something like when the Supreme Court of the United States declares officially that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is something that without it, we have no plant life on the earth, therefore everybody dies.
I think what they're really declaring is that excessive carbon dioxide is pollutant. And it's not a pollutant, what it is a greenhouse gas. And that's a true statement because we actually need to have a greenhouse in order to live down here.
You have blood in your body. And you need that blood to live. But your blood is also considered by anyone who works in medicine as a
Toxic.
medical waste. A dangerous, a hazardous medical waste. So that's how that kind of stuff works.
We have
There's
another-
always context.
Right?
Okay.
Okay.
Another question back here.
Okay, so with the tomatoes, it's going to bug me if I don't get this out. They
Tomato.
actually had a very good reason to believe that tomatoes are poisonous. It's because that they ate tomatoes on these plates, and people would occasionally die, but they didn't realize it's because tomatoes are naturally acidic, and the plates had mercury in them, and so the tomatoes would soak up the mercury, and if people ate the whole tomato, they would die.
That's an interesting theory, but it's wrong on so many levels because people didn't know about leaching metal out of their metal containers as far back as the Romans.
Yeah.
They understood that you shouldn't drink wine out of metal containers. I don't think so.
There's a lot of myths of wives' tales. When I teach the history of science, I often like to read, and this is going to get a little uncomfortable. I read an excerpt from Pliny the Younger, who basically wrote this. Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, they wrote this encyclopedia of knowledge, and he has this one thing in which he basically describes the hazards of women's menstruation. And it's like this long list of how it will, cause mirrors to lose their reflectivity, and all these things. And you read it, and you're just going like, this is patently ridiculous. But this was common knowledge in which a very well-educated man back in ancient Rome completely believed in. And we have lots of knowledge that we just acquire because it comes from trusted sources, or it comes from places that we really don't apply our skepticism to. Because skepticism and science is hard, and it takes a lot of effort. And it's just easier to accept these common stories. And it's easy to condemn people nowadays, but we have so many conspiracy theories that we buy into in this country. Not everyone, but a variety of people in the country buy into certain conspiracy theories. And there's a bunch of myths that we regularly buy into. And there's a bunch of things that we've only seen through like film or something. Like the one I really like, now this is going to sound weird, but when you shoot someone, do they fly back?
No.
No, they drop. But do they fly back in the movies and in TV? Oh, yes, because they're trying to create a dramatic moment.
Maybe we should talk about some science fiction ones, because I know we have some science fiction writers in here. But we should still talk about a few of these, and some of these are pretty easy ones, like sound, you don't hear explosions in space. There's nothing to transmit the sound waves. You cannot hear explosions in space.
Yes, but you don't hear background music warning you either.
No, it's brilliant. The movie Crap, when all of the debris is just killing stuff. Oh, Eric.
My solution to that is that it's a matter of computer to human interface. That essentially, if you're piloting your starfighter, and you can't see everything at once, and so auditory cues help you out. So if you hear whoosh, that lets you know, hey, there's somebody coming in over me. And if you hear pew 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 pew, it's like, oh my goodness, someone's shooting at me with a laser.
That's a good solution.
So this is the AI in the ship, giving the pilot
auditory cues as an interface.
This is augmented reality.
I love it.
So with explosions in space, if I'm on the inside of a spaceship, would I hear an explosion? Or would the air get sucked out so quickly I could not hear it?
Like an explosion coming from within your vessel? Or
Yeah, like it exploded out. So I'm on the inside. I'm on the inside, it explodes out into space.
You would hear the sound wave as it went through the atmosphere within your vessel, and then you would all get sucked out.
No, if it's not that dramatic, what you can do is you can hear your ears pop as your pressure suddenly drops.
That brings up another myth. So you get sucked out into space, and you're not wearing a spacesuit. And your eyes bulge out, and you explode. No, that actually doesn't happen.
I should have known immediately that Mission to Mars was going to be horrible when that astronaut exploded after opening his face shield.
Now your blood vessels may expand a bit, and as long as you're rescued soon enough, you can be okay.
Ballpark like 30 seconds?
Yeah, basically, once the oxygen in your blood getting to your brain is used up, then
Your brain dies.
you're gone.
Yeah.
So it's like drowning.
Now here's the thing: you shouldn't hold your breath, because that actually can cause problems.
You need to let the breath out.
Yeah, you need to let the breath out. Otherwise, it can overexpand your lungs.
But one of the things that can happen is you can get the bends. Who knows what the bends are? Yeah. So when those of you who don't know, the bends is what happens when your body, which is used to a certain amount of atmospheric pressure to keep nitrogen that's in your blood from forming bubbles. When that atmospheric pressure goes away, then the nitrogen in your blood starts to form bubbles. And if the bubbles get big enough, they can actually cause serious damage. They certainly will be painful if you have a case of the bends and you live.
Oh, I was just going to laugh about, when you're talking about sound, it's like, we've all seen the movie Jaws, and then we go out to the ocean and we instantly the
I think it sounds like in my head, so maybe there is some truth.
How about this one? Banking your spaceship.
Because that looks cool.
Even the Enterprise will bank when it doesn't turn. It's just incredible.
Well, one of the things I really like about Babylon 5 is that their spaceship mechanics were realistic.
Oh,
the expanse now too.
Yeah.
Bowser effect.
You have a question?
We were talking about space and explosions. We see a lot of people who there's an explosion, people fly out and then other people hold on to them and say, nope. Can that happen?
People are weak. No, seriously, people are weak.
I always thought people should be losing their arms over this sort of thing. But
You know, they're not that strong.
No.
Yeah, I mean, usually people are not strong enough to tear their own arms off.
Okay,
But
why
if they
don't we-
run
why don't we
into something
just-
metal, they
I'll
will.
give you an example, okay? All you have to do is go to the gym and hold on to something. How long can you hold
Oh, no.
on? Okay, well, someone else. Someone who's, walking abs. How long can they hold on?
That's on the person, it's not on.
It's not long. Yeah.
But if you
Our
do want
hands
to
are
know what can happen, talk to paratroopers. Paratroopers have the scariest stories about mid-air collisions, about what will happen if a man's leg and another man's helmet meets at 200 miles per hour.
Oh.
And maybe it gives an idea. But yeah, professionals have to deal with hybrid situations. Maybe they can give you a clear idea of what can happen in somewhat similar situations.
At how many miles an hour?
200
Or
miles.
whatever it is. I'm exaggerating.
Terminal
here, but-
velocity is about 210, and
Right.
you would only get that with somebody falling at terminal velocity, somebody's.
Yes. But I mean, like for exaggeration purpose, I mean,
Basically,
relative
you need to have
velocity, though, we gotta combine it.
And then someone who actually has formed a torpedo
Yeah.
is going there to reduce your much.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. Why don't we do a little wrap up starting in this
Myths or
Either
bust.
your favorite myth or yourself or both. Shameless self-promotion is also allowed here.
Okay, well, I'll just repeat, mass market paperback of my novel Unforgettable comes out in May. It's about a CIA agent who can't be remembered more than a minute after he's gone.
Yeah.
By other people, that is.
I got nothing because my books did not make it through grade space enough time to be here in the knowledge I'm in. So I'll just say, me and Allison will be at Juniper 650. And we'll talk, Alicia, sorry. Oh my gosh. Conspiracy theory. But we're going to talk about colonialism and how it conquered countries. So if you want to talk about that very specific things, we'll be there.
I would just encourage people to think about what they think about, and when they disagree with majority opinion, they need to have a good reason to disagree with the majority opinion in which they've actually done some research and thought through it and not engaged in conspiracy theories. And oftentimes, one of the first indicators is people are trying to trick me because most of the time people aren't trying to trick you. Well, talk radio is, but we won't go anywhere there.
I would leave you with, consider the following resources. Read the newspaper. Actually watch the mainstream media, the dreaded mainstream media tend to get things right more often than not. Websites like Snopes.com, factcheck.org are not liberal conspiracies. If you have a question about a story that comes along that, if it sounds interesting, if it sounds exciting, if it makes you angry, chances are someone is telling you a story. And you can check it out and find out what's really behind it.
The stories that are too perfect are almost always wrong.
That's right. Never believe a meme.
If you see a quote on the internet from some founding father that happens to just hit current politics on the nose,
They probably didn't
chances
say
is
it.
No, they aren't making it up.
And you can't see laser beams in space.
Yeah.
Sure.
So there's no, you would have to have some sort of mist or something that's
The
diffusing
beams
so you
have
can
to
actually
reflect
see
off
it.
something. There's nothing in space to reflect off of.
Nor like a laser beam, like Star Wars calls them blasters because it's not lasers. They're blasters. There's something else that was slower than bullets and doesn't even make sense. But a real laser beam is just, it would look like a bullet except for that you would have burns with where it hits you.
you can see a laser beam in space if it's aimed at your eye.
Yeah,